In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We are considering today the chapter 8 of the book Introduction to Saint Thomas Aquinas, or Introduzione a San Tommaso d'Aquino by Fabro. And the guiding question in this chapter 8 that we are studying today is the following. What is the real value of the notion of participation in the Thomistic synthesis? And the answer to this question, according to Fabro, is participation. So participation is the essence of Thomism. So I would like to start showing Fabro's position with some history, how he discovered this notion, and then we'll consider the participation, the doctrine of the participation, and the doctrine of act and potency. And third, we'll consider the heuristic value of the notion of participation. We are going to say at the end of the second point that the notion of participation of the doctrine of act and potency in terms of participation has a greater heuristic value. So I will try to explain why Fabro says that in this chapter. So first of all, some history. In 1931, when Fabro was 19 years old, he received his doctorate in philosophy, and his focus was the problem of causality. In fact, his thesis was the defense of it from the attacks of Hume. 3 years later, he won a competition at the Angelicum and the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. And his monograph was also related with causality. The principle of causality, psychological origin, philosophical formulation, necessary and universal value. And while he was writing this monograph, he had his first encounter with the notion of participation. And this encounter, as he says, was decisive for the rest of his life. And he recalled it in this way. I will read his words. The encounter with the notion of participation as the speculative hermeneutical key at all levels was fortuitous but not casual. I was making the last adjustments of my paper for the academic competition, but I did not feel at peace, even though I was aligned with the majority of the Thomistic and neo-scholastic authors. One night, he continues, perhaps troubled by the latent concern, I woke up suddenly and a thought came to my mind that seemed to me simple and radical. The final critical formula of the principle of causality must be the same as that with which Saint Thomas expresses the first and radical dependence of the creature on the Creator. I got up of bed and opened the first article of the question 44 of first part of the Summa Theologica. So in that article, Saint Thomas asked whether it is necessary that every being be created by God. And he continued, and immediately I found the radical formula that I was looking for. And from that moment, the metaphysical notion of participation was present in his whole metaphysical reflection at its foundation. And this Fabrian reflection has 3 stages. The first stage corresponds with his book, The Metaphysical Notion of Participation according to Saint Thomas Aquinas. In this book, Fabro shows that the Thomistic notion of participation, and it's very important to highlight the word Thomistic. So it's the Thomistic notion of participation. So in this book, he shows that this notion is the summit of the metaphysical reflection. This notion is totally original to St. Thomas. That is, this notion is not in Plato nor in Aristotle. And this notion allowed St. Thomas to take from both Plato and Aristotle what was correct in their thoughts and to surpass them by creating a new metaphysical reflection rather than a synthesis of both. The second stage was marked by his book Participation and Causality according to St. Thomas Aquinas. In this book, Fabro shed light on the fundamental point of Aquinas' philosophy, showing the difference between this metaphysic, so St. Thomas Aquinas' metaphysic, and that of the scholastics and the neo-scholastics. Father Fabro shows the profound originality of St. Thomas in terms of participation. In the preface of the book, wrote by Ray Marker, he says, "The book projects a vivid light upon the fundamental points of St. Thomas' metaphysics. In many ways, he, Fabro, has done the work of pioneer, being, participation, causality, all terms familiar to him, and that have led him to the root of the metaphysical problem. His ambition is to better comprehend that the profound structure of beings cannot be established and supported without the total and unconditioned participation of being from the absolute pure being, the first cause." And the third step was to show how the Thomistic notion of participation, something, as I said, totally new in St. Thomas, was lost by the Thomistic school. According to Fabro, that loss caused the tricky dialogue that Thomism began with modern philosophy. This tricky dialogue ended in Thomism adopting the modern transcendental, thereby changing its direction and transforming it into another philosophy. That is, they missed the very Thomistic reflection. They, the Thomistic school, did not consider the being, the ens in Latin, as a composite of essence and being, essentia et esse, and they replaced this fundamental and primary composition with the couplet essence and existence. Having made that change, they could not consider being, the act of being, as the foundation of the being, the ends, the foundation of the being, the foundation of the ends. Without that foundation, the whole Thomistic speculation is compromised and is no longer able to dialogue with modern philosophy. On the contrary, it is the originality of the Thomistic notion of participation, according to Fabro, that allows Thomism to be enriched with the intuition of the modern philosophy. Thomism is able to save true immanence. According to Fabro, modern philosophy cannot save true immanence because modern philosophy is founded in Cartesian cogito. And the Thomism is able to save true immanence because it finds the foundation of the participated beings in the act of being by participation. Father Fabro says, "This seemed to me the original discovery of Thomistic metaphysics, with which all his speculative reflection stands or falls, both on the structure of reality and on the dynamics of the spiritual life of thought and freedom, in the order of nature as well as in that of grace, and with which he assumed, by way of a powerful passage to the limit, the speculative core of the contrast of Parmenides and Heraclitus, known only as second-hand, and above all, that of Plato and Aristotle, known by Thomas first-hand, although in different way." So the second point, participation or act of and potency. We said that the Thomistic metaphysical notion of participation is the summit of the metaphysical reflection, and it is central in St. Thomas Aquinas' reflection. But, as you probably know, there are many authors that consider that St. Thomas' thought revolves around the Aristotelian doctrine of act and potency. One of these authors is Manser, who, following the Leo XIII's call, tried to point out the essence of Thomism. So the first thing that Fabro highlights in this chapter is the absolute correspondence between both doctrines, being by essence and being by participation, participated and participant, act and potency. So there is a correspondence between these doctrines, participation, the doctrine of participation, and the doctrine of act and potency. But we are talking, and this is very important, about the Thomistic notions of participation and act and potency. There is no correspondence between the Aristotelian doctrine of act and potency and the Platonic doctrine of participation. St. Thomas, as we said, arrived at a new conception of both doctrines. Both doctrines helped him to make a new synthesis that surpasses both Plato and Aristotle. According to Fabro, St. Thomas arrived at the new concept of the couplet act and potency, one totally absent in Aristotle. So the concept of act and potency in St. Thomas are different than the concept of act and potency in Aristotle. And he arrived at the new concept of act and potency thanks to the doctrine of participation. And because of this, Aristotelianism is totally renewed with the notion of participation, and particularly the couplet of act and potency that were reinterpreted and separated from identity with the couplet form and matter. Therefore, St. Thomas was able to discover a more profound foundation of the being, the ens in Latin, applying the couplet of act and potency in a transcendental realm instead of the predicamental realm, which is the composition of form and matter. So, St. Thomas applied the concept of act and potency in a transcendental realm. That is to say, he applied that to the concept of act, to the act of being, and the concept of potency to the essence. Thus, we can say that by arriving at this highest point in his own metaphysical synthesis, St. Thomas can easily distinguish the composition of matter and form from that of essence and act of being, that is Fausto. And of course, the new couplet participated and participant. So participated is the act and participant is the potency. St. Thomas says, "It is therefore clear that composition of act and potency has a greater extension than that of form and matter. Hence, matter and form divide material substance, while potency and act divide being in general, ens communem. Consequently, whatever follows upon potency and act as such is common to both material and immaterial created substances." That is in the Summa contra Gentiles. So, as the conclusion of this, Fausto says that although there is a total correspondence between both couplets, act, potency, and the couplet participated, participant, and Fausto expresses this correspondence in the following terms, is the conclusion of this second point. Four points he highlights. First of all, the two couplets, participant and participated, then in Platonic terms, and potency and act in Aristotelian terms, are intrinsically complementary in the foundation and constitution of Thomistic metaphysics. Second, so are intrinsically complementary. Second, the Platonic one, in comparison to the Aristotelian one, displays a greater heuristic value for the discussion and investigation of problems. And we're going to see this in the next point. I will try to show you why the notion of participation is better in order to explain the metaphysics. Third, the Aristotelian one, on the other hand, is seen as more adapted to the systematization of conclusions that have been acquired already and to the analytic derivation of the properties of objects. And fourth, both cases concern a methodological emergence of one over the other, but not a complete substitution or replacement. The Platonic couplet remains far too imprecise if its results were not to be placed under the Aristotelian couplet, just as it remains imprecise and unproductive, indeed damaging in those thinkers before or after Thomas, who chose not to make use of the Aristotelian tool. He mentioned Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa. However, the Aristotelian couplet would be no less sterile if it were not preceded and sustained by the Platonic one, as with Averroism. And after pointing these 4 points, Father Fabro says, it is hard to say that Thomism's speculative originality consists of, but I think that rather than identifying a particular text or doctrine, it will be more accurate, historically and doctrinally, to point out the harmony that the system has achieved in all its parts, not by the analytic development of one principle, but a wise arrangement of those two contrary demands. Do not the constitutive principles of every true synthesis always present consider at the beginning a certain contradictions? So the third point is I will explain a greater heuristic value that the notion of participation has. So talking about heuristic value means to talk about the capacity that this notion has in order to help solving or discovering problems, things, and concretely metaphysics, to explain the reality. So Father Fabro analyzes more than 30 texts in order to show that participation is the basic doctrine that Saint Thomas uses in order to demonstrate composition in the finite beings, the finite ensia. And according to Fabro, he shows this in his book, the Metaphysical Notion of Participation. And according to Fabro, in that book, he said that the most important of this quotation is the late treatise about the separate substances, the substances separatis. In chapter 9, St. Thomas shows the complete course to reaching the distinction between essence and act of being. He begins showing that the first philosophers arrived to the distinction of substance and accident, then the distinction in the essence between form and matter. But he said those distinctions are not enough to found the being, to found the ends. And using the doctrine of participation, he arrives at the distinction of essence and act of being. So in his reasoning, it is the doctrine of participation that guides him rather than the doctrine of act and potency. So it is the doctrine of participation that allows St. Thomas to affirm the metaphysical emergence of the act of being. St. Thomas gave a new dimension to the Aristotelian doctrine of act and potency, that is the conception of act of being, esse ut actus, or actus essendi. Something totally absent in Aristotle. Fabro says, in the Thomistic understanding, the entering of the Aristotelian act into the intentional circle of participation neither denies nor diminishes the meaning of act, but rather it more radically actualizes the first sense of act. It is the perfection of potency and precedes it. So, the Aristotelian act, the Neoplatonic participation, and the Thomistic act of being, esse ut actus, are three moments of the Thomistic reflection, but this moment cannot be considered as an abandonment of a doctrine to take another doctrine. So an abandonment of the act of potency to take participation, and then the abandonment of participation to take the doctrine of act of being. But rather, those moments are three moments of the Thomistic reflection that are simultaneously present in his doctrine, in all his thought. So, it is the doctrine of participation that allows St. Thomas to discover the original composition of the being, the ends, the composition of essence and act of being. So it is participation that expresses the first fall of being, of the esse, from the being by essence to being by participation. And without doubt, St. Thomas took this principle of participation from Platonism, and it is the Platonic context that implies the different moments of the participation. The participation by essence, in Latin the perfectio separata, as a basis or foundation of the indivisibility and fullness of the act, and the division and fall of this act, that is the perfection by participation, that implies composition, participant who receives, and participated, what is given, or potency who receives, and act, what is given. So in this context, the act of being is the fullness of perfection, because other perfections, in order to be a perfection, need to participate the act of being. Otherwise, that perfection wouldn't be, and because of this, could not be a perfection. Father Fabro says, as the form precedes the matter, and it is transcends it, the being, the esse, the act of being, that is act and perfection of the essence, precedes and transcends the form and the essence of which it is act as well. The being, the act of being, is the third emergent act, and because of this, it can be considered as the highest determination of God, subsistent being, being itself, according to Exodus. So this act of being forms the essence of the Thomistic metaphysics. And St. Thomas used the notion of participation to distinguish the two realms of causality, transcendental and predicamental. The former, the transcendental, comes from Platonism, and the latter from Aristotelianism. However, St. Thomas combined in a perfect rapport both doctrines and gave to the created being, to the created ends, a real foundation and justification. And that foundation and justification is the act of being. In this way, he succeeds in inverting the direction of the Western thinkings, according to Fabro, what Heidegger does not get despite his best effort. And, continue Fabro, in pointing out the being, the act of being, as the act par excellence of the being, of the ends, and the foundation of causality. From here, the intrinsic connection that the mind manages to establish between the essence of God as subsistent being and his causality according to the characteristics of the intensive universality, plenitude, and totality that belong to him. That is a quotation from Participazione e Causalità. So, St. Thomas Aquinas subordinated the metaphysics of act and potency to the metaphysics of participation. He founded the notions of act and potency upon the notions of participated and participant, because it is the doctrine of participation that best shows the emergence of the metaphysics of the act of being. And this is the most original part of St. Thomas' metaphysics. And, unfortunately, it was soon ignored by his followers, and Fabro has the merit to rediscovering it. So while it's true, as we said above, that there is a perfect correspondence between the couplet of act and potency and the couplet of participated and participant, it is also true that it is the doctrine of participation that guides the mind in order to understand this correspondence. In fact, if we consider the act without considering participation, the act in itself says nothing about limit. Potency is that which limits the act, and that was the problem of Avicebron, his philosophy, and is also the problem in formalism. They had to resolve as resolutio, that is, resolve means foundation, the things in the potency, rather into the act, because the act in itself, according to this philosophy, says nothing about limits. That is, the difference between two things comes from the potential principle rather than the actual principle. The actual principle is the act of being. So if we consider the act of being in God, the being by essence, and in the creature, being by participation, without considering the doctrine of participation, we will say that the difference between both acts is that the act of being of the creature is received in a potency and that potency limits the act, while God's act is not received by a potency. So, in this consideration, it is the potency that makes the difference rather than the act. On the other hand, in the metaphysics of participation is the ontological fall of the act that marks the difference between the being by essence and the being by participation. And because of this, at least in my understanding, St. Thomas, looking for a more adequate terminology, explained the composition of act and potency in terms of participation, as we saw above, especially when we mention the Substantiae Separatis, one of his latest writings. Consequently, it was the doctrine of participation that guided St. Thomas in order to resolve the acts into the act of being. As we just said, each act implies a different participation from the act by essence. That means that each act is different in itself and not because of the potency that receives it. And this allows the mind to be open to the variety of perfection that each participation has, and to resolve those perfections into a superior perfection, the perfection by essence, and those perfections by essence into the perfection of being. That is to say, whatever perfection we find is a perfection. For example, white. White is a participation of whiteness. So we resolve each white perfection into the whiteness. But whiteness doesn't give reason of itself. So we need to resolve whiteness in another perfection. So from resolution to resolution, until we arrive to the last or first perfection, that is the perfection of being, that is the last perfection, because the being doesn't need another perfection to support it. However, each perfection needs the being in order to be. So need to be supported by the being. And in this way, the intelligence can conceive the intensive notion of being. So from resolution to resolution, we arrive that each perfection depends on the being. So we can resolve if each perfection in the act of being, or the esse intensive in Latin, or the intensive notion of being. And this notion is totally absent in Aristotle and in those who don't consider the metaphysical notion of participation as a central doctrine of Thomism. Therefore, the reflection leads the mind to the metaphysical notion of being, totally contrary to the formalist notion of being, that is, the consideration of being as a formality. In formalism, as you know, the being, the act of being, is another form, even more, is the most precarious form, since it is the most general or the emptiest form. And because of this, those who don't understand the Thomistic notion of participation don't have objection in equating existence with the act of being. In fact, in many translations, they translate the word esse in Latin as existence, something that is totally absent in St. Thomas Aquinas and is present in those who don't understand the metaphysics of participation according to the interpretation that we follow, that is the Fabros interpretation. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.